Warning: this episode contains descriptions of violence, killing, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Bright on Buddhism. Today we feel uniquely compelled to diverge from our regular schedule for a while to address an issue that seems increasingly pressing in the United States. Today we'll be talking about Buddhism and violence. What constitutes violence in Buddhism? How does the conception of violence change over time? According to the Buddhist scriptures, what ought to be done about violence? So, let's begin. What constitutes violence in Buddhism?
In Buddhism, violence is defined quite simply. It's defined as any kind of harm against any sentient being. There are many types of violence in Buddhism, just like in all other schemes of thinking about the world. Let's think through it together in terms of, let's say, expanding circles of perpetrations of violence. There's violence in the mind. There is violence performed unto oneself. There's violence done unto others. And there is violence done unto you by others. These types of violence all have several contexts and debates within different Buddhist sectarian schemes or streams of thought and practice. But the question at play in all of this strikes at the heart of Buddhist practice, namely the precept of non-violence, ahimsa. Debating and defining real actions as violence or not, according to ahimsa, is extremely relevant because it calls into question how to practically apply the precept and the doctrine, as well as calling into question all of this doctrine of karma that we've talked about before. What should actually be done or not done in the observance of ahimsa, the precept of nonviolence against all sentient beings? This is the key question of all religions, in my own opinion. The question is, how do practitioners actually apply the doctrines they share with each other? This very application into practice of doctrine is an act of interpretation that is not neutral, but is rather deeply influenced by numerous factors, such as culture, history, and so on. This is very much the case in Buddhism as well. There are serious debates about the moral status of violence in history, and we cannot say that the precept of ahimsa itself defines the boundaries of what violence is and what is acceptable and unacceptable. The precept of ahimsa is vague with regards to how the day-to-day actions of people ought to be weighed against other doctrinal and practical considerations. Combined with this, in Buddhism, violence is a property of the 6 realms of samsara in varying degrees. In the hells, violence happens all the time, and in the realm of gods and heavens, it happens less. There's a source of this violence, and it's marked by dependent origination, meaning that it arises due to causes and conditions, and that's what situates it in this system of karma. Therefore, while defining violence is deceptively simple in the Buddhist context, classifying, explaining, and situating real actual acts of what might be called violence against each other and against the doctrine is a very complex issue, which becomes a subject of debate from very early on in Buddhist history. Let's unpack this issue one level at a time, starting with violence in the mind. We've talked before that there is no duality between imaginary and real, no duality between here and there, etc. That same principle applies to violence as well. If one thinks about violence against another sentient being, even if they don't act on that thought, they've committed a karmic transgression, and they have accrued bad karma for it. That is because of a number of reasons. The simplest reason comes to us from the nature of the Eightfold Path. We've talked about how the points on the path are nesting. That is to say, they're concentric within each other. We've said before that right resolve is a cause and condition for right speech. Right speech is a cause and condition for right action. Right action is a cause for right livelihood. Right livelihood is a cause for right effort, and so on and so forth. They all lead into each other. So violent thoughts lead to violent speech and violent action, and then that causes violent resolve, and the cycle spirals onward. The same can be said of all kinds of violence we'll be talking about for the rest of the episode, so I won't repeat it when we get there. Now let's discuss violence done unto oneself. This is the first stage where we find the issue of violence becoming increasingly complicated. The reason for that is that self-sacrifice is good, necessary, and important in the Buddhist context. Is it violence against oneself to practice the austerities, for example, whenever you regulate how much sleep and how much food you get? The conventional Buddhist argument is that no, it's not violence unless it goes too far. It's coming out of a desire for attaining enlightenment, and it's not coming out of a desire to cause pain unto oneself or anyone else, and therefore is not violence. This is the logic of the middle way. complete self-deprivation or complete assault of one's sensibilities with sensory pleasures and indulgences are both hindrances to mindfulness and are violence performed unto oneself. That is the argument of the middle way. One must support themselves along the path. They must not starve themselves, but they also must not fall prey to the indulgences of the sensory world. This does not totally resolve the issue, however. The reason why is because there are some grisly practices in Buddhism which are regarded as sacrificial and not violent, but still appear to do direct harm unto one's body. These include copying sutras in one's own blood, burning incense on one's scalp, and even self-immolation. We've talked a bit about these in the past. How are these forgivable acts of violence? The answer is that the difference lies in intention. As I said before, if one commits a physical sacrifice like that from the intention or mindset of harming oneself, or the desire to be dead and not alive, or to inflict pain on oneself and not experience pleasure, then that's violence done unto oneself. If they do it to create a karmic connection with a sutra, however, or to symbolize their commitment to the Dharma, or to protest an unjust war, or something like that, the conversation changes. Intention becomes ever more important than the result of the action. It's an open debate whether these practices I've mentioned have any reliable textual evidence or justifications, but they are all still established practices with a strong doctrinal justification by the people that do them, even if the Buddha didn't say himself, go and do this. Next, we can mention violence done unto others. This is also complex. From a dogmatic perspective, any violence of any kind against any other sentient being is a violation of the precept of ahimsa and accrues bad karma and should not be done. However, the history of Buddhism is just not that way. One of the greatest military figures in history, in other words, one of the most effective killers in history, was a Buddhist and established a Buddhist kingdom through violence. I speak of Ashoka, a 3rd century Indian king. We'll discuss him more another time, but I should say that he's a very interesting character. On top of that, there is a doctrine of upaya, which we've talked about before, which holds that intention and enlightenment, again, justify actions. This is reliant on the idea that if somebody is enlightened, they would never do something that makes somebody suffering worse without also at least simultaneously advancing them on the path somehow. The issue is that it's not clear-cut who is enlightened or not, and who can and cannot use skillful means in that way. Holding all of that aside, we can even point to Chan and Zen practices. We've talked about in the past how it's been a practice in Chan and Zen for a master to slap a student on the face or hit them on the back and shoulder with a yardstick in order to divorce them from discriminatory thinking and calculation and give them a taste of what is called pure experience, which can be a door to enlightenment. Is this violence? Absolutely yes. I've been on the receiving end and it hurts really badly. But the results, if they are to be believed, are that the individual has some deep realization or experience because it's happening before they can even think, before they can even differentiate good from bad, hurt from pleasure, and so on. Thus, it may be thought that the ends justify those means. I leave that to the listener to decide.
I will chime in here to say that, from experience, I can tell you that getting hit in the face is unique. I'm not sure if I would say it's enlightening, but I could also understand why somebody would say it is. So, again, this is violence, but I at least understand where they're coming from on this one.
It's like Muhammad Ali used to say, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. And that's kind of the idea. They want to reset the person's brain.
They don't want them to have a plan.
Exactly. They don't want them to have a plan because that's discriminatory. And I don't mean discriminatory as in sexist, racist. I mean discriminatory as in differentiated and scheduled and structured thought.
The very literal meaning of discriminatory.
Exactly. And this is stuff that is completely contrary to the path that they're trying to walk down. Finally, let's discuss violence perpetrated unto you by another. We know that this is bad, and we know that we want it to not happen, but I should mention that every religion gives a reason for why and how it is bad when something bad happens to us. In Buddhism, the reason that violence that is perpetrated unto us is bad is that it creates unwholesome mind states which lead to dukkha in the moment. It makes us desire for the absence of pain, which is the result of violence, but there is no such thing as the complete and total absence of pain. This causes us to feel different ways about the state of things, such as anger, sadness, etc. These feelings lead to dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. The world is not empty of pain and negative mind states because it is unsatisfactory. That's the first noble truth. There's not much more to be said about it than that. This sort of thing happens all the time, and it's regrettable, and it's the reason why we're called to defeat dukkha and desire, and so on, in Buddhism.
How does the Buddhist conception of violence change over time?
As I mentioned, there are important changes we can see in the conceptions and contexts of particular kinds of violence in Buddhism, particularly with regards to the issue of self-sacrifice and upaya, or skillful means. These are obviously very much later developments in the Buddhist scheme than the Four Noble Truths, for example. They reflect ongoing debates between the Mahayana and the Theravada, and even between Mahayanists themselves, about what counts as moral and immoral. Obviously, from a historical standpoint, Mahayana Buddhism is the site for all sorts of religious innovation. Religious innovation refers specifically to the creation of texts, ritual traditions, commentaries, and so on, which might not have been a part of the original canon. So when I say religious innovation, I say that word neutrally, not meaning to denigrate the Theravada as not being innovative, but certainly to refer to the fact that Mahayana Buddhism necessarily innovated as a means of making do with a world where Shakyamuni himself is no longer present, making do in a world where he died and they have to figure out how to teach themselves and how to practice and attain enlightenment in this very world itself. In other words, in grappling with the nature and the specifics of the Buddhist way in a world where Shakyamuni has died, Mahayana Buddhism acknowledges and encourages practices which are not always reflected in the Pali Canon texts. That leads to debate among Mahayana sects and schools, but also between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists in a broad sense, about what is and what is not truly canonical and effective practice, but also about what the nature of Buddhist morality is and how to live according to it. Once again, I'm not here to say that Theravada has not done any religious innovation at all, but I do mean to say that they claim to stick much more closely to the canon than the Mahayana people do, and thus look down upon such Mahayana practices as slapping your student really hard or lighting yourself on fire. Those are violent, and the Buddha never said to do any of that in the texts. If we step into the Mahayana context only for a while, though, then we can see these debates going on even as this innovation is taking place. Some Mahayana texts will say, that practice is not useful, you should do this one instead. For example, slapping is not present at all in Pure Land Buddhism. They say that all of those that engage in such practices are exerting themselves uselessly, and that there is no useful self-originating practice. One must entirely rely on the faith that they have in the Amida Buddha. However, if you remember, Pure Land Buddhism questions conventional Buddhist morality more than any other sect of Buddhism that we've discussed. They don't say that you shouldn't slap your student because to do so is violent. They say that you shouldn't do it because it's not reliant on faith in Amida. One of the biggest innovators of Pure Land Buddhism, who we'll talk about in a future episode, known as Shinran, writes, "The good man achieves rebirth in the Pure Land. How much more so does the evil man?" In that sense, is violence a good thing or a bad thing for getting born in the Pure Land? That's a complicated question for another time, but it reflects that there is a constant and ongoing discussion of what is regarded as useful and what's not, and violence functions in that debate. What is conventionally held as violent in the Buddhist scheme later gets employed for practical reasons, such as in the case of Zen Buddhists slapping enlightenment into their students, or it gets recontextualized, as in the Pure Land, where all morality is questioned significantly.
According to the Buddhist scriptures, what ought to be done about violence?
Similar to our prior episode concerning evil, violence ought not to be taken passively, but also ought not to be handled in a way that sours the karma of anybody. Violence is still a reality that exists, and although Buddhism encourages non-violence, loving kindness, compassion, and sympathy for all sentient beings, violence still ought not be tolerated. It goes without saying that there is a strong tradition of nonviolent protest and self-sacrifice in Buddhism that cannot be ignored here. We can look at Gandhi, for example, and his nonviolent protestations against British rule. He was a Hindu practitioner, but it's well known that he read and respected a lot of other traditions from India, but also around the world, such as Sikhism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and so on. This nonviolent protesting is reflective of an idiom that is identical to the one for evil. The idiom is, if violence is done unto you, you are not asked to turn the other cheek. Instead, you ought to address the issue non-violently, lovingly, kindly, compassionately, sympathetically, and so on. In colloquial terms, we say killing them with kindness. This doesn't mean being nice to your oppressors in the hope that they will be better someday, because they won't. That's just complacency, which is not good. It leads and opens the door to more violence. This literally means changing them and their behaviors in a way that does not worsen your karma or theirs. In the United States, violence motivated by a variety of factors is on the rise and is simultaneously ever more highlighted in the media and the news cycle. We see constant news of Christian white supremacists attacking drag shows and LGBT+ events, white Republicans attacking electrical substations, neo-Nazi groups being arrested for planning to overthrow the government, and so on and so forth. During the pandemic, we saw anti-maskers rioting and protesting and exacting violence on flight attendants and business owners for attempting to get them to follow the rules and wear masks. It feels like there is a shooting in America every single day, and the reality is that on average, there's actually more than one per day. The total sum of shootings in the US in 2023 exceeds the number of days that have passed. Often, you find that it was a radical right-winger who fomented the shooting. We understand that the most recent school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee was perpetrated by a self-identifying left-winger. While it's true that left-wingers do carry out mass shootings from time to time, a look at any reputable statistics on the matter will show you that they're very much the minority when it comes to carrying out gun violence, and people on the right side carry it out much more often. And either way, it goes without saying that we condemn all violence regardless of political affiliation or motivation. This violence is unacceptable. It must stop. According to the Buddhist scheme, what must be done about it? Certainly, the response should not be more violence. That is to say that knowing that there is one side out there that longs for war and longs for violence and a fascist overthrow of the government, we should not let them have that. We should not let them have the war that they want. War only leads to more violence and death, which in the end is all unnecessary. Again, as I've mentioned, Buddhism argues that you ought not to just lay down and take it and hope that something will be better in the future. No oppressor has ever looked at a petition or a peaceful protest and said, "They're right, I've been horrible to X group, I should change my ways and give them a chance at what they want." That's never happened in the history of humanity. So just laying down and taking it or doing useless virtue signaling is not a viable option, and neither is anything which would sour our own karma. There is a middle way that is possible. Peaceful nonviolent protesting, self-defense, and effective mobilization of a force of resistance of fascism in all of its forms are viable options. As mentioned before, Gandhi figured this out, and others in history have as well.
This is the point where normally I would do an outro and we talk about what we're talking about next week. But like with the last episode, instead we're going to step out of scholar mode and talk about what we're talking about directly.
Things are not so great in the United States, or in the West at large right now. There are legal and economic forms of violence being enacted on entire groups of people from the top levels of power in the country and in other countries. And at the same time, there are targeted forms of physical violence being enacted upon the same groups from the people who support those highest levels of power. This cannot continue. There's no both sides about it. This is not one way of doing things and then there's some other way out there. For so many people in this country, what I'm talking about is life and death. I have extremely leftist political views, and I have never hidden them on this show, but at the end of the day, given the landscape in the US and in other places, I'm at the point now where I simply do not care about dumb shit like, should we have a sales tax of 7 or 8%? I just want the government to not withhold medical care from 50% of the population. I want the rule of law to apply to everybody fairly. I want something to be done about the people in government and in regular public who are exacting violence on women, LGBT+ people, people of color, and everybody else who's being persecuted these days, while the people who do the violence are getting away with it. I'm not really asking for much here. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, to shut the fuck up and leave people the fuck alone, and just focus on your own little life. In this world, you have to actively choose to be an asshole, and to try and control other people's bodies and minds, and to interfere with somebody else's life in some sort of immeasurably inconvenient and obnoxious way. You have to actively choose to make the world worse, and if you do, you shouldn't just get away with it. When you do, then everybody else around you is now forced to work twice as hard to undo whatever dumb shit you did, and then make the world better. Being wrong and stupid and problematic is such a massive fucking inconvenience to every single other person in the world, and I strongly advise against it.
We have to deal with the reality here. It only takes one person wanting violence for there to be violence. It only takes one side wanting a war for there to be war. The Buddhist idea to deal with this is to provoke changes in the opposite side, non-violently and compassionately. But that's also being done by bodhisattvas and fully realized Buddhas. We're just people. We can't do that. So we have to address the situation as it is. We need to get ready. We have to all rise up together in solidarity and prepare to protect each other and resist fascism in all its forms. This is going to get worse before it gets better, and we need to be preparing for that now. Thank you for listening to this episode, despite the dire topic. We've got one more of these super serious ones before we return to our normal schedule. Next week, we're going to talk about Buddhism and social revolution. What is the relationship between Buddhism and social revolution? How has that relationship played out in history? How has it played out in the modern era? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.